What happens when a corrupt cop pulls over the wrong person? He thought she was just another easy target, until he saw her FBI badge. But that was only the beginning. Because this time, the system picked the wrong woman to silence. The evening sun cast long shadows over the quiet streets of Minneapolis. Jasmine Carter kept her hands steady on the steering wheel as she drove past rows of suburban houses, their porch lights flickering on one by one. The day had been long, filled with tense meetings and endless reports. But at least it was over. The familiar hum of her car should have been comforting. But something felt off. A quick glance in her rearview mirror sent a ripple of unease through her. A police cruiser had been trailing her for the past few blocks. At first, she dismissed it as coincidence, routine patrol, nothing more. But as she changed lanes and took a different route toward home, the vehicle did the same. She exhaled slowly. Years in law enforcement had taught her how to stay calm under pressure. Still, she couldn't ignore the knot forming in her stomach. The flash of red and blue lights flooded her car's interior. Jasmine sighed, pulling over to the side of the road. She kept her hands visible on the wheel, just as she had advised countless civilians to do when dealing with law enforcement. Her pulse remained steady, but her mind raced. She hadn't been speeding. No traffic violations. What was the reason for this stop? The crunch of boots on pavement signaled the officer's approach. She rolled down her window, keeping her expression neutral. The man standing outside her car door had the build of someone used to throwing his weight around. Officer Patrick Reynolds. She recognized the name immediately. His reputation preceded him. Too many complaints of excessive force. Accusations that never stuck. License and registration, he said, his voice clipped. He didn't bother with pleasantries. Jasmine kept her expression composed as she reached into her bag and pulled out her wallet. Instead of her driver's license, she flipped open her FBI credentials and held them up. Special Agent Jasmine Carter, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Can you tell me why I was stopped? Reynolds barely glanced at the badge. His lip curled slightly, as if the sight of it offended him. Step out of the vehicle. Ma'am. A slow wave of irritation crept up her spine. Excuse me? You heard me. Step out of the car. Jasmine remained seated. On what grounds? Reynolds leaned in slightly, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. Don't make this difficult. For a split second, the thought crossed her mind. How many times had she seen encounters like this go wrong? How many people had been forced out of their cars without cause? Just because someone in uniform decided they could? She took a steady breath. Officer Reynolds, you're aware that detaining a federal agent without probable cause is a serious offense. Correct? A muscle in his jaw twitched. Step out of the car. Jasmine clenched her teeth but complied. She moved slowly, deliberately, stepping onto the pavement with her hands visible. She wasn't about to give him any excuse. As she stood there, her gaze flickered to something beyond Reynolds. A dark sedan, parked across the street, no license plates. Its windows were tinted too heavily to see inside, but she could feel eyes on her, watching. A sharp gust of wind rustled the leaves on the pavement, but the street remained eerily silent. Reynolds took a step closer. You think that badge makes you untouchable? Jasmine didn't answer. She was no longer thinking about Reynolds. Someone else was here, and they were waiting. Jasmine stood still, her feet planted firmly on the pavement, the cool night air brushing against her skin. The tension between her and Reynolds crackled like static electricity. He wasn't just another cop on a power trip. There was something more beneath the surface. Something calculated. Turn around, he ordered, motioning for her to face her car. She met his gaze, unflinching. On what grounds? A slow smirk crept across his face. Suspicious behavior. You fit the description of someone we're looking for. Jasmine exhaled through her nose. Steady and controlled. It was a flimsy excuse. One she'd heard too many times before. She could challenge him, throw legal jargon at him. But she knew how this worked. He wasn't trying to find a reason. He was testing how far he could push. Reynolds took his time circling her car, running a hand along the trunk as if expecting to find something incriminating. The longer he stalled, the more control he asserted. From the corner of her eye, movement caught her attention. A car idled at the curb, its driver watching intently. A man in his 40s. Pale-faced, gripping the steering wheel with both hands. The rideshare logo in the corner of his windshield told her everything. He was an Uber driver. A witness. He hesitated before raising his phone, angling it just enough to start recording. Reynolds noticed too, his jaw tensed, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. But instead of backing off, he leaned in closer to Jasmine. "See, you feds like to think you run things," he muttered under his breath, voice low enough that only she could hear. "But out here, we decide who walks free and who doesn't." Jasmine kept her breathing even, her mind working through every possible outcome. If she protested too hard, it would escalate. If she backed down, he'd take it as submission. A beat passed, then another. Reynolds straightened, letting out a dramatic sigh. "Looks like you get to go home tonight, Agent Carter." His tone was mocking, like he was granting her a favor. She didn't move. "Unless," he added, lips curling, "you'd rather I find a reason to bring you in." Jasmine met his stare, unwavering. "We both know you don't have one." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The Uber driver continued filming, now emboldened, his hands steadier. Reynolds exhaled sharply and stepped back. "Drive safe." The words dripped with false courtesy. Jasmine turned without a word, sliding back into her car. As she pulled away, her pulse remained steady, but her mind raced. 2 blocks down, her phone vibrated against the console. She glanced at the screen. No caller ID. A text message. "Be careful, you're poking the hornet's nest." A chill ran down her spine. Morning light filtered through the tall glass windows of the FBI field office, casting long shadows across Jasmine's desk. She sat with her laptop open, scrolling through case files, but her mind wasn't on her current assignments. It was on Reynolds. The encounter from the night before played over in her head. His arrogance, the veiled threat, the presence of that unmarked car watching from a distance. It wasn't just about a power-hungry cop throwing his weight around. There was more to this. She pulled up his name in the FBI database, her fingers moving with precise efficiency. What she found didn't surprise her. Multiple complaints filed against him, excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation tactics. Yet, in every case, the investigation had been closed with no disciplinary action. Either the victims withdrew their statements, or internal reviews ruled in Reynolds' favor. Jasmine exhaled, leaning back in her chair. Someone had been protecting him. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. She hesitated for half a second before answering. "Carter." A male voice came through, quiet but firm. "Agent Carter, we need to talk." She recognized the voice immediately. Daniel Hayes. They had crossed paths before, briefly, during an interdepartmental task force meeting months ago. He was younger than most in his unit, sharp, with a reputation for questioning authority. That alone made him an outlier. Jasmine lowered her voice. "What is this about, Officer Hayes? You need to be careful," he said. "Reynolds isn't acting alone." Her grip on the phone tightened. "Go on. There's a group inside the department. Cops who look out for each other. No matter what, they make problems disappear. Silence people who get too close." He hesitated. "I think they see you as a problem." Jasmine's eyes flickered toward the office door, making sure no one was listening. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I signed up to serve the public," Hayes said, "not to cover for men like Reynolds." Jasmine nodded to herself. There weren't many like Hayes, willing to risk everything to do what was right. "Can you prove it?" she asked. A pause. "Not yet, but I can point you in the right direction." Jasmine took down the information he gave her. It wasn't enough to take action, but it was a start. By the time she left the office that evening, she had made up her mind. She wasn't going to wait for another encounter with Reynolds. She was going to find out exactly how deep this ran. She drove through the city streets, headlights reflecting off damp pavement. The air was crisp, the sky an ink-dark canvas speckled with distant stars. Then, flashing lights filled her rearview mirror. Again, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach as she pulled over. This wasn't coincidence. 2 officers approached her vehicle, different from last night, but with the same rigid posture, the same air of quiet menace. The taller one leaned in. "License and registration." Jasmine's jaw tightened. She handed over her documents, watching them carefully. The second officer circled to the back of her car. Out of sight. Her pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. Moments later, he returned, holding a small plastic bag between his fingers. Well, he said, looks like we got a problem. Jasmine's blood ran cold. The bag contained a white powder. Cocaine. The officer smirked. Step out of the vehicle. Ma'am. Jasmine didn't move. That's not mine. Doesn't matter. His voice was smooth, almost amused. It's in your car. This wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. She knew exactly what was happening. And this time, she wasn't walking away. The air inside the precinct was thick with the smell of old coffee and sweat. A mixture of exhaustion and authority. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the gray walls. Jasmine sat on the cold metal bench inside a holding cell, her wrists still sore from the too tight handcuffs. Reynolds stood just outside, arms crossed, watching her like a predator waiting for its prey to break. His smirk was the kind that came from knowing the game was rigged in his favor. You know, he mused, tilting his head, I thought you'd put up more of a fight. But I guess even the mighty FBI folds when the cuffs go on. Jasmine met his eyes without flinching. You're too eager, Reynolds. That's what's going to get you caught. His smirk faltered for just a second. But he recovered quickly. That's cute, really, but let me explain how this works. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You're in my house now. And I decide how long you stay here. Jasmine had expected as much. He wasn't just trying to humiliate her, he was playing for time. The longer she sat in this cell, the harder it would be to fight back. No access to a lawyer. No way to contact the FBI. He wanted her helpless. But she wasn't. Outside the cell, Daniel Hayes stood near the booking desk, his fingers tapping anxiously against his belt. He had been there when they brought her in, had watched the whole thing unfold. And yet there was nothing he could do. Not yet. His gut told him this wasn't right. Jasmine Carter wasn't the kind of agent to get caught up in something like this. The entire arrest felt too neat, too convenient. He kept his eyes on Reynolds, watching the way the man carried himself, too confident, too certain of his control. Hayes had seen enough in his time on the force to know that when someone acted that sure of themselves, they had something to lose. Jasmine, still seated, let out a slow breath. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice calm. If I were you, I'd make sure you know exactly what's on that dashcam footage before doubling down on this lie. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. What? Jasmine tilted her head, feigning curiosity. Unless you're absolutely sure that camera didn't pick up something inconvenient. A bad angle, a mistake. You know how these things go. One little oversight, and suddenly internal affairs is crawling all over this place. Reynolds stiffened, just for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but she caught it. She pressed on. Of course, if you're confident everything checks out, then no worries, right? Reynolds forced out a chuckle. But there was an edge to it now. He pulled out his phone, texting someone with quick, deliberate movements. Jasmine didn't need to see the screen to know what was happening. He was making sure the footage was erased before anyone could see it. Hayes, still watching from a distance, caught the shift in Reynolds' demeanor. That slight hesitation, the way his jaw tightened. It was enough. With a careful glance around the room, Hayes moved toward one of the precinct's back offices. He knew where they kept the dashcam footage before it was officially processed. If Reynolds was trying to cover something up, this was his chance to get to it first. Inside the dimly lit office, Hayes sat down at the terminal, typing in the credentials he'd memorized from his time handling evidence reports. The footage was still there, but not for long. He saw the deletion request pending, the system waiting for final authorization. He didn't hesitate, plugging in a flash drive. He copied the file. A minute later, it was done. Back in the holding cell, Jasmine leaned back against the wall. She had no way of knowing what was happening outside, but she had planted the seed of doubt. That was enough. For now, Jasmine sat on the hard bench inside the holding cell, staring at the cracked paint on the concrete walls. Hours had passed, and she still hadn't been allowed a phone call. That alone told her exactly what was happening. They weren't just holding her. They were isolating her, cutting her off from anyone who could help. Across the precinct, Reynolds moved through the halls like he owned the place. exuding the quiet arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. His confidence wasn't unfounded. If history was any indicator, he had always managed to walk away clean. Jasmine exhaled slowly, steadying herself. He was stalling, waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger on whatever fabricated evidence he had planned. If she didn't act fast, the next time she walked out of this building, it might be in cuffs for good. In another part of the station, Daniel Hayes stood in the dimly lit stairwell, his fingers curled around his phone. The copied dashcam footage burned in his pocket like a live wire. He knew what he had to do, but doing it meant crossing a line he might not be able to come back from. He thought about Jasmine. He had only spoken to her a handful of times before tonight. But she didn't strike him as reckless. And she sure as hell didn't seem like someone who'd be caught up in something as sloppy as a drug charge. This was a setup, he knew it. Just like he knew Reynolds was behind it. Taking a breath, Hayes made his way down the hall to an office tucked away from the main floor. Behind the desk sat Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, her gray-streaked brown hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun. She had been with the force longer than most. And despite the politics, she still had a reputation for playing by the book. Mitchell barely looked up as Hayes stepped in, closing the door behind him. "You better have a good reason for being here," she muttered, still focused on the paperwork in front of her. Hayes hesitated. If he said the wrong thing, she might report him. But if there was anyone in this department who still had a conscience, it was her. "It's about Reynolds," he said finally. That got her attention. She leaned back in her chair, watching him carefully. "Go on." Hayes took out the flash drive and placed it on her desk. "This is the unedited footage from Jasmine Carter's arrest." Mitchell frowned, picking it up. And if you watch it, you'll see that she was set up." She studied him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. Then, without another word, she plugged the drive into her computer. For the next few minutes, the only sound in the room was the hum of the old desktop and the faint murmur of voices from outside. Hayes watched as Mitchell's expression shifted from neutral to tense. Then finally, to something resembling anger. When the video ended, she closed the screen and let out a slow breath. "This is bad," she murmured. Hayes nodded. "Reynolds thinks he's untouchable. If we don't do something now, Carter's career is over. And who knows how many more he'll bury before someone stops him." Mitchell tapped her fingers against the desk, deep in thought. Finally, she met Hayes's gaze. "I'll report this," she said, voice low. "But understand something. Reynolds isn't acting alone. If I move on this, it won't just be him coming after us." Hayes swallowed, his jaw tightening. He had known this wouldn't be easy. But hearing her confirm it made it all the more real. Mitchell stood, smoothing out her uniform. "I'll send this up the chain to the FBI," she said. "But you need to warn Carter. Reynolds isn't going to let this go without a fight." Mitchell sat alone in her office, the glow of the computer screen casting sharp lines across her face. The report had been sent. Every detail, every second of the footage, laid out in a formal complaint to Internal Affairs. She knew the moment she hit send, there was no turning back. She had expected pushback. Maybe some passive-aggressive emails. A delay in processing. What she hadn't expected was the phone call that came barely an hour later. "Lieutenant Mitchell." The voice on the other end was low, measured. "This is a dangerous road you're walking." She gripped the phone tighter. "I did my job, that's all." A pause. Then, quieter. "Then you should know that some things are bigger than one bad cop." The call disconnected. Mitchell leaned back, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't just about Reynolds. He had protection, higher than she'd realized. And now, so did she have a target on her back? In the holding cell, Jasmine felt the shift before she saw it. The way the officers moved around her had changed. Some avoided eye contact altogether, while others looked at her with something closer to curiosity than contempt. The doubt had started creeping in. Reynolds was losing control of the narrative. And he knew it. Across town, a local news broadcast cut to breaking coverage. The anchor, poised and professional, delivered the headline with practiced neutrality. "FBI agent Jasmine Carter has been arrested on drug possession charges." And new footage suggests the Bureau may be covering for one of their own. A heavily edited video played on screen. Grainy dashcam footage, cut together just enough to paint Jasmine as uncooperative, aggressive, A close-up of the bag of drugs. The officers exchanging glances. Then static. The implication was clear. Watching from his apartment, Daniel Hayes clenched his jaw. He had seen the real footage. He knew exactly what Reynolds had done. And now, the story had been twisted beyond recognition. His phone sat on the table. The flash drive with the real video beside it. He could fix this. He could send it to the press. Expose Reynolds for what he was. But then what? If he did this, there was no taking it back. He would be burning every bridge in the department. Putting himself on the wrong side of people with real power. He ran a hand over his face. Exhaling slowly. Then, with a decision made, he grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He found the number. Lisa Morgan, investigative journalist, one of the few left who still cared more about the truth than ratings. He hit send. Jasmine sat in the dimly lit holding cell, her back against the cool concrete wall. The night had stretched long, filled with hushed voices and the occasional clatter of boots in the hallway. She wasn't sure if it was exhaustion or instinct, but something had shifted. The tension that had once suffocated the room now felt fractured. She noticed it in the way some officers glanced at her, not with the smug satisfaction she had seen before, but with something closer to hesitation. Doubt. Hayes had done something. Meanwhile, Reynolds sat in his office, his fingers drumming against the desk in slow, deliberate taps. His gut told him something was wrong. Someone had gone against him, but he didn't know who. He had been careful, always careful. The department had protected him for years, burying complaints before they ever made it to internal review. But now, the narrative was slipping from his grip. He leaned forward, gripping his phone. When the call connected, his voice was low, measured. "We have a problem." Jasmine, still in her cell, stiffened when she heard the door unlock. Reynolds walked in, his expression unreadable. "You think you're smart," he said, stepping closer. "You think you've got friends in here. But let me tell you something. Whatever little hope you're clinging to, it won't matter." She didn't flinch. "That depends on how desperate you get." His jaw tightened. For the first time, she saw it. A flicker of uncertainty. He exhaled sharply and leaned in. "You like to play hero, Carter. But heroes tend to end up in accidents. Houses catch fire. Car brakes fail. Families suffer." A cold rage settled in her chest. But she didn't let it show. That was what he wanted. Instead, she tilted her head slightly. "You must be really scared to be talking like this." For a moment, his mask slipped. Just a second of raw anger before he turned and walked out. Across town, Daniel Hayes sat in a dimly lit diner, stirring a cup of coffee he had no intention of drinking. Across from him, Lisa Morgan, a seasoned investigative journalist, tapped her nails against the table. "You realize what you've handed me, don't you?" she said, sliding the flash drive between her fingers. Hayes nodded. "It's real, unedited." She studied him carefully. "You do understand that if I put this out, your name won't stay hidden for long?" He looked past her, out the window. "It's not about me anymore." Lisa exhaled, glancing around as if sensing something off. Then, as if on cue, her phone buzzed. A blocked number. She frowned but answered. The voice on the other end was quiet, almost amused. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ms. Morgan. Walk away while you still can." Her stomach twisted. Hayes watched her carefully. "What?" Lisa slowly put the phone down. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, but her hands were clenched. "Reynolds isn't the one pulling the strings." The morning news cycle hit like a tidal wave. Every major network ran the story. The unedited footage, the clear evidence of a setup, it was undeniable. The voiceover from the broadcast was steady, controlled, but the outrage in the country was anything but. This newly surfaced video contradicts the official police report regarding FBI agent Jasmine Carter's arrest. The footage suggests she was framed, raising questions about corruption within the Minneapolis Police Department. Clips of the uncut dashcam video looped in the background. No erratic behavior from Jasmine. No drugs in sight before the officer conveniently discovered them. Just a calm, methodical attempt to railroad her into a charge that wouldn't hold up under real scrutiny. By noon, the first protest signs were up. By evening, the streets downtown were flooded with people chanting her name. Jasmine sat in the holding cell, watching the flickering glow of TV coverage from the mounted screen outside. She could hear it in the station, too. Officers murmuring in hushed voices. Footsteps heavier than before. The weight of uncertainty had settled in the air. She wasn't just another suspect anymore. She was a symbol now. Reynolds, however, wasn't backing down. If anything, he was digging in. He stormed through the station halls, his fury barely contained. He had counted on this whole thing going smoothly. A quick arrest, a scandal that smeared her reputation just enough to make people look away. But now, his name was being whispered along with hers. And that was unacceptable. He slammed his office door shut, dialing a number with sharp, precise movements. The voice that answered was calm, almost amused. "You lost control." Reynolds clenched his jaw. "Fix it." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "It's being handled." At that moment, an officer knocked on the door. Hesitant. "Sir, Internal Affairs just called. They want to release Carter." Reynolds gripped the edge of his desk. "Not happening. They're already on their way." Jasmine was being processed out of holding when the first scream rang through the station. The lights flickered, the air filled with sudden, panicked voices. Then, heavy boots, multiple figures, moving fast. Before anyone could react, a group of masked men burst into the room. Tactical gear, armed, efficient. It took less than 15 seconds for them to grab her. Officers shouted, drew their weapons, but the intruders were faster. Jasmine barely had time to register what was happening before a bag was pulled over her head. The last thing she heard before darkness swallowed her was Reynolds shouting orders. His voice laced with something she hadn't heard before. Fear. Jasmine woke to the sharp scent of oil and rust. The air was thick, stagnant, and cold against her skin. Her wrists burned where the zip ties dug in, and the rough texture of a chair beneath her told her she was restrained. The bag over her head was yanked off abruptly, and fluorescent light seared into her eyes. She blinked rapidly, her vision adjusting to the dim glow of a single overhead bulb swinging slightly from the ceiling. The room was large and industrial, concrete floors, exposed beams, stacks of wooden crates lining the walls. She wasn't in a police precinct anymore. A man stood in front of her, arms crossed. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but he carried himself like someone who had spent years in law enforcement. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, holster visible beneath it. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, but his eyes were cold. "You're not asking where you are," he observed. Jasmine shifted in the chair, testing the restraints. "I already know. Someplace off the books. Someplace you don't want found." The man smirked. "Smart." He pulled up a metal folding chair and sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees. "You've been causing a lot of problems, Agent Carter." Jasmine didn't respond. She wasn't going to play into whatever mind game this was. The man tilted his head. "We both know this isn't about that traffic stop. Not anymore." He leaned in slightly. "What do you know?" Jasmine met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You'll have to be more specific." The man sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed. "Let's not do this. You've been digging, talking to the wrong people, stirring up things that don't concern you." He gestured vaguely. "This whole situation could go away if you were willing to be reasonable." Jasmine gave a humorless smile. "That so?" His expression hardened. "I'll ask one more time. What do you know about us?" Jasmine didn't blink. "Enough to know you're afraid." The backhand came fast, the crack of skin against skin echoing through the empty space. Jasmine's head snapped to the side, but she didn't give him the satisfaction of reacting. The man flexed his fingers, as if shaking off the sting. "That was a mistake," he said, voice low. Jasmine exhaled. "Steady." "No," she murmured. "You hitting me was the mistake. Because now you've told me exactly how desperate you are." The man stood, jaw tightening. "You think this is desperation? You have no idea who you're dealing with." She tilted her head slightly. "Then why hide?" His expression darkened, but before he could speak, another voice cut in from the shadows. "Enough." Jasmine turned her head slightly, straining to see. Another man stepped forward, his posture rigid, authoritative. The first man stepped back immediately, like a subordinate receiving orders. Whoever this was, he was higher up the chain. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel Hayes paced the length of Mitchell's office, his phone pressed to his ear. "She's not answering," he muttered, running a hand over his face. Mitchell sat at her desk, pulling up police reports, news alerts, anything that might give them a lead. "Something's wrong," Hayes said. "If Internal Affairs ordered her release, she should have been out by now." Mitchell nodded, then hesitated. What if she never left? Hayes stopped pacing. The implications hit them both at the same time. She had never made it out of the precinct. His mind worked fast. "I can track her." Mitchell gave him a sharp look. "How?" Hayes was already unlocking his laptop. "She carries a government-issued phone, right? They all have GPS tracking embedded." He began inputting information, fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. "If she still has it on her, I can find her location." A few seconds passed, then a map loaded onto the screen. A blinking red dot. Hayes narrowed his eyes. "She's not at the precinct." Mitchell stood, leaning over to look. The GPS showed an industrial zone, far from the city center. "A warehouse," Hayes murmured. Mitchell straightened. "We can't go through official channels." "Not yet." Hayes clenched his jaw. "Then we go off the books." Jasmine sat still, breathing slow and controlled. The ropes around her wrists had loosened slightly after hours of subtle movements. She hadn't tried to escape yet. Timing was everything. If she failed now, they'd tighten their grip. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the warehouse. She recognized the pattern. Controlled, purposeful. The man from before. He stopped a few feet away. "Still comfortable?" Jasmine didn't bother answering. The man chuckled. "You're going to have to accept the inevitable, Agent Carter. Some fights aren't meant to be won." She tilted her head slightly. "That why you're hiding in a warehouse instead of a courthouse?" His smirk faltered just enough for her to know she'd struck a nerve. Then, a distant noise. Not much, but different. A shift in the air. The faintest hint of movement outside. Jasmine kept her expression neutral, but her heart pounded. Someone was coming. Outside, Hayes crouched near the warehouse entrance, his grip firm on his sidearm. Mitchell knelt beside him, speaking quietly into her radio. A handful of trusted officers were positioned at different points around the building, waiting for the signal. "We go in quiet," Mitchell murmured. "No warning shots. We don't know how many are inside." Hayes nodded once, then moved toward the side entrance. The door was unlocked. A mistake on their part. Or arrogance? Either way, it worked in his favor. Inside, Jasmine spotted a small stack of files sitting on a nearby crate. Thick folders, unmarked. That was unusual. Any police-related documents would have department seals or case numbers. These didn't. She shifted slightly, just enough to scan the top page. A name jumped out at her. A senator. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just about dirty cops. This was bigger. The first shot rang out just as she moved. Chaos erupted, yelling, heavy boots slamming against the concrete. Jasmine kicked out hard, toppling the chair she was tied to. She hit the ground and rolled, scrambling for cover as bullets tore through wooden crates around her. Hayes burst through the side door, weapon raised. He took down the first armed man in his line of sight, then spotted Jasmine diving for safety. "Carter." She turned, still trying to free her hands. He fired twice over her shoulder. Someone had been moving in behind her. Mitchell and her team flooded the room, taking positions, clearing the area as quickly as they could. But then, a slow clap. Reynolds. He stepped out from behind a metal pillar, a smug smile on his face, even with guns pointed at him. "Well," he said, "I suppose this is the part where you all think you've won." Jasmine stood, finally free from the restraints. "You're done, Reynolds." His grin didn't fade. "Am I?" Then, a gunshot. Reynolds staggered, his hand clutching his side. Hayes held the smoking weapon. "That's for Carter." Reynolds stumbled, but he didn't fall immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to Jasmine. His lips moved, voice a ragged whisper. "You think you've won?" He rasped. "This game is bigger than you know." His body finally gave out, collapsing onto the concrete floor. Jasmine exhaled, the weight of his words settling into her bones. Jasmine gripped the stack of files as she and Hayes rushed through the warehouse's back exit. The night air was thick with tension, sirens wailing faintly in the distance. Mitchell followed close behind, Her radio silent. No official calls. No backup. They were alone in this. The weight of what they had found settled in Jasmine's chest. Names. Transactions. Entire case files that had been buried. Erased from the system. This wasn't just a few corrupt officers covering their tracks. This was an operation that ran deep. Politicians. Business executives. Even law enforcement brass. Inside the SUV, Hayes drove with a tight grip on the wheel. The city lights blurred past as Jasmine flipped through the documents. She felt sick. Some of the reports dated back decades. Mitchell exhaled sharply from the passenger seat. This isn't just Minneapolis. This goes federal. Jasmine's phone buzzed. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A low, distorted voice filled the car. You think you're ahead. You're not. Jasmine's fingers curled around the phone. Who is this? The voice didn't hesitate. You can't outrun this. You can't expose what doesn't exist. A pause. Justice is an illusion. Agent Carter. The call ended. A chill ran down Jasmine's spine. This wasn't a warning. It was a certainty. Before she could react, Hayes cursed under his breath. We're being followed. Jasmine turned to look. 2 cars. No sirens. Moving in sync with them. Mitchell clenched her jaw. We need to lose them. Now. Hayes swerved onto a side street, cutting through an alley barely wide enough for the vehicle. The tires screeched as he made a sharp turn onto another road. The trailing cars struggled to keep up, but they didn't give up. Jasmine checked the files. Then her phone. We have to get this out before they wipe everything. Then, as if on cue, her screen glitched. The FBI database, her access portal, was vanishing before her eyes. File names disappeared. Case numbers were erased in real time. They're wiping the system, she whispered. Hayes's knuckles turned white on the wheel. Then we make sure they don't wipe us next. Mitchell was already dialing someone. We need a safe house. Somewhere off-grid. Before she could finish the call, Jasmine's phone buzzed again. A different number. The message was short. A location. A meeting point. But what caught her attention was the sender. An agent from the FBI. Someone she trusted. Or so she had thought. The safe house was a dimly lit, abandoned office space on the outskirts of the city. The air smelled of dust and old paper, and the hum of a flickering fluorescent light filled the silence. Jasmine sat at a worn-out desk, flipping through the documents they had risked everything to recover. Every name, every transaction, every cover-up, it was all here. Mitchell stood by the window, her gaze scanning the streets below. They're not going to stop, she muttered. We either go public now, or we disappear. Hayes was pacing, his nerves barely contained. Even if we release it, what's stopping them from burying it? We need to hit them where it hurts. Before Jasmine could answer, her phone vibrated. A blocked number. She hesitated, then answered. A familiar voice came through. Smooth and controlled. Agent Carter. We should talk. Jasmine stiffened. Who is this? You already know. She did. The voice belonged to Chief Alan Merritt, the man who ran the department. The one who had protected men like Reynolds for years. Let's skip the theatrics. Merritt continued. I'm offering you a way out. Jasmine's grip tightened. And what would that be? Merritt sighed, almost sounding tired. You walk away. You forget everything you found. In return, this all goes away. No charges. No retaliation. You get your life back. Jasmine glanced at Hayes and Mitchell. And if I don't? A brief pause. Then, calmly, then you won't have a life to get back to. The call ended. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Hayes let out a slow breath. Well, that settles it. They're scared. Jasmine met his gaze. Which means we still have a chance. An hour later, they had a plan. Lisa Morgan, the journalist Hayes had contacted before, had agreed to set up a live press conference. No leaks, no pre-recorded segments. Everything would go out raw, real-time, before anyone could stop it. By the time they arrived at the news station, the city was already buzzing. Protesters had gathered outside, demanding answers. The press conference had barely started when Jasmine stepped onto the podium. She took a deep breath. Then she spoke. She laid it all out. Every cover-up, every lie, every life destroyed by the corruption in the department. She named names, showed the documents on live television. The city was watching. The country was watching. Then, the shot rang out. Chaos erupted. Security tackled Jasmine to the ground as the crowd screamed. Hayes and Mitchell ducked for cover, scanning for the shooter. But Jasmine wasn't hit. She looked up just in time to see a body collapse onto the stage. Lisa Morgan. A second shot fired, missing its mark. The crowd surged, people running in all directions. Security swarmed, officers moving in. And through the chaos, Jasmine saw him, Chief Merritt, standing at the edge of the scene, watching. His face was calm, but his eyes told her everything. This wasn't over. Jasmine sat in the dimly lit hospital room, a dull ache pulsing through her shoulder where the bullet had grazed her. The bandages were tight, but the pain wasn't what occupied her mind. It was the world outside. The attempted assassination had failed, but the consequences were still unfolding. On the television mounted in the corner, news anchors debated her credibility. Some sources suggest Agent Carter staged the attack to gain public sympathy. One of them speculated, the footage of the chaos replaying in a loop. Is this all part of a larger political game? Jasmine exhaled slowly. She knew this would happen. When corruption was exposed, the system didn't admit defeat, it adapted. It fought back. Mitchell entered, her expression tense. They're pushing the narrative hard. Every station is running the same angle. You're a manipulator. A liar. Jasmine clenched her jaw. And Merritt? Mitchell pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages. Still untouchable. But something's happening. There's been a closed-door meeting scheduled with the mayor, city officials, and top brass from the department. Jasmine's eyes narrowed. They're planning their next move. Across the city, Hayes sat in his car, staring at the grand entrance of a luxury hotel. The meeting was happening inside. His fingers hovered over his phone. He had already bypassed the security cameras in the lobby, an old skill he rarely used anymore. He just needed to get inside. A tap on his window made him jump. Mitchell's voice came through the cracked glass. You sure about this? Hayes nodded. We need something solid. If we don't stop them now, they'll rewrite the truth. Mitchell slid into the passenger seat. Then let's get to work. Inside the hotel, a private conference room had been secured. The air inside was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Merritt sat at the head of the table, surrounded by city officials and business leaders. This needs to end, a councilman muttered. The protests, the scrutiny, were hemorrhaging public trust. Merritt took a measured sip of his drink. Then we shift the narrative. He gestured toward a man sitting at the far end of the table, his chief strategist. The man cleared his throat and placed a file on the table. A suspect has been arrested. A lone gunman, radicalized online. We release a statement tying him to fringe elements, discrediting Carter's claims in the process. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Merritt leaned forward. And the evidence against us? The strategist smiled. Will cease to exist by morning. In the ventilation shaft above them, Hayes adjusted his position, heart pounding. Every word was being recorded. The final piece of the puzzle was in his hands. Jasmine sat in the back of the dimly lit newsroom, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. The weight of what they were about to do settled on her chest like a stone. On the screen in front of her, a countdown timer flashed. 10 minutes until they went live. Hayes and Mitchell stood nearby, watching as the production team prepped the studio. The atmosphere was tense, thick with anticipation. This is it, Hayes murmured. Once this airs, there's no going back. Jasmine nodded. I know. The evidence they had gathered wasn't just damning, it was nuclear. The recording from the secret meeting. The files linking high-ranking officials to decades of corruption. The money trails connecting city leaders to organized crime. It was more than enough to bring down Chief Merritt and his entire network. But there had been an offer. Hours earlier, an intermediary had reached out, someone with power, someone who could make things disappear. They had presented Jasmine with a choice. Release some of the evidence, take a controlled win, and ensure her own safety. Or go all in and risk everything. Mitchell crossed her arms. You're not actually considering a deal, are you? Jasmine exhaled slowly. If I hold back even a little, I can protect myself, maybe protect all of us. Hayes shook his head. And what about the people who don't have that choice? The ones who've already been buried by this system. Mitchell leaned forward, voice firm. You didn't fight this hard just to let them win another way. Jasmine's pulse steadied. They were right. If she hesitated now, the cycle would continue. The producer gave them the signal. 1 minute to air. Jasmine stepped onto the stage. The bright studio lights blinding for a moment. The cameras adjusted their focus. The anchor gave a brief introduction, then turned to her, and Jasmine began to speak. She laid it all out. The corruption. The lies. The lives destroyed in silence. She named names, revealed the evidence, let the weight of the truth settle into every word. By the time she finished, the newsroom was silent. The anchor swallowed hard before speaking. For those just tuning in, what Agent Carter has exposed tonight will undoubtedly shake this city to its core. Within minutes, headlines exploded across the country. The footage of Merritt's secret meeting played on loop, his voice damning himself with every word. By the end of the night, warrants were issued. Merritt was arrested, so were high-ranking officers, city officials, even a few state representatives. The system they had built for years was collapsing under the weight of its own deception. Jasmine watched it all unfold from a distance, exhaustion settling deep into her bones. She had done what she set out to do. But just as she allowed herself to breathe, her phone buzzed. She frowned, checking the screen. No caller ID. She hesitated, then answered. A low voice, calm and controlled, came through the line. "You think you've won?" A pause. Then, almost amused, "This war is just beginning." The call ended. Jasmine sat in the dark, the city lights flickering beyond the window. She had taken down one piece of the machine, but the machine was still running. Jasmine sat in the quiet of her apartment, the glow from the television casting faint shadows against the walls. The news played on a loop, images of police officials being led away in cuffs. Headlines screaming about the biggest corruption scandal in the city's history. It should have felt like victory. But it didn't. Her phone vibrated on the table. She picked it up, expecting another call from a reporter. But instead, it was a text from Mitchell. "Turn on Channel 5, now." Jasmine grabbed the remote and switched the station. The screen flickered, revealing a well-groomed anchor with a serious expression. "New developments tonight in the so-called police corruption case," the woman said, voice smooth but edged with something calculated. "While several high-ranking officers remain in custody, sources tell us that the arrests may have been politically motivated. Was this a real pursuit of justice? Or a dangerous attack on law enforcement itself?" Jasmine's grip on the remote tightened. A split-screen image filled the broadcast, one side showing her at the press conference, the other featuring a former police commissioner shaking his head in disapproval. "Make no mistake," the man was saying, "we are witnessing a witch hunt. These officers served their city for years. Are there bad apples in every profession? Sure, but tearing down an entire institution over a few mistakes? That's reckless." Jasmine exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. She had expected this. They weren't trying to argue facts, they were rewriting the narrative. Her door buzzed. She opened it to find Hayes standing there, jaw clenched. He stepped inside without a word, dropping a crumpled letter onto the table. Jasmine unfolded it. A single line stood out. "Officer Hayes is hereby placed on indefinite suspension pending further review." She looked up. "They're making an example out of you." Hayes let out a short, humorless laugh. "I guess exposing corruption doesn't make you popular at the department." Mitchell arrived minutes later, her expression unreadable. "It's worse than we thought," she said, sitting down. "A judge just overturned several of the arrests. Some of those guys are walking free." Jasmine frowned. "How?" Mitchell leaned back, rubbing her temple. "It wasn't just one judge. It's a network. Same people who protected Reynolds. Merritt. All of them. They're still pulling strings." Hayes shook his head. "So we took down a few players. And the system just rearranges itself?" Jasmine stared at the TV, where the news anchor had moved on to a new segment, talking about crime rates and how losing seasoned officers could endanger the city. She took a slow breath. "We didn't come this far just to let them win the second round," she said. Hayes and Mitchell exchanged a glance. "What are you thinking?" Mitchell asked. Jasmine looked at them both, her voice steady. "We go deeper." Jasmine sat in her FBI office, the soft glow of her computer screen illuminating her face. The news played on mute in the background. More reports about the corruption scandal. More debates over whether the arrests were justified or politically motivated. The cycle never ended. The headlines no longer shocked her. She had known from the beginning that taking down a few names wouldn't be enough. Systems didn't collapse overnight. They adapted. They retaliated. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Hayes stepped in, his usual confidence dulled by exhaustion, but his resolve still intact. "They offered me a deal," he said, dropping a piece of paper onto her desk. Jasmine picked it up, a carefully worded letter from the department, stating that if he stayed quiet, if he walked away from the case completely, his suspension would be lifted in 6 months. No charges, no further consequences. Hayes let out a sharp laugh. "They think I'll take it." Jasmine set the paper down. "Will you?" He met her gaze, unwavering. "Not a chance." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. Another email, this one from a national civil rights organization. Mitchell had told them about her, about what she'd uncovered, about what she'd risked. They wanted her to consult on a police reform initiative, help craft policies that could prevent another Reynolds. Another merit. Jasmine exhaled slowly. She had spent her entire career fighting against corruption from the inside. But what if there was another way? Hayes leaned against the desk. "So what's next?" Jasmine glanced out the window, watching the city move below her. "We keep going. We push harder." Hayes smirked. "Good. I was hoping you'd say that." As he turned to leave, she noticed Mitchell waiting in the hallway. Unlike Hayes, she wasn't carrying frustration, she was carrying a decision. "I'm leaving," Mitchell said simply. Jasmine frowned. "The force?" Mitchell nodded. "They'll never let me do real work from the inside. So I'm going to fight them from the outside." Jasmine studied her carefully. "And how exactly are you planning to do that?" Mitchell gave a small, knowing smile. "I have some ideas." Jasmine knew that look. The fight was far from over. Just as she stood to walk them out, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an email. A text. "No caller ID. You survived this time. But the system never forgets." Jasmine stared at the screen for a long moment, then locked her phone. She stepped out of the office, the weight of everything still heavy on her shoulders. But she had made her choice. The war wasn't over, and she wasn't done fighting. In a world where power protects power, standing up for the truth comes with a price. Jasmine Carter knew that justice wasn't a single victory, it was a battle that never truly ended. So, the question is, how many more will have to fight before the system truly changes? What do you think? Can corruption ever be fully exposed? Or does it just find new ways to hide? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories that uncover the truth, don't forget to subscribe to Covert Truths, because some battles are too important to ignore.